You have developed an instrument to compare income levels worldwide. What have been the most significant trends in the last few decades?
Well, the most significant trend in the last few decades were two, actually. The one is that, generally speaking, in most countries, income inequality went up. And obviously we know that in rich countries like the United States, Great Britain, even Germany, Sweden, but also in countries like India, China, and Russia. And the second important trend is that global inequality, despite all what I said just now, global inequality went down because of very high growth rates of China and India.
But if you don't speak about China and India and have a look at the whole world and the other countries?
Well, the other countries, if I don't speak of China and India, then of course we are leaving out, 40% of the world. But in the rest of the world, inequality did go up because in individual countries it went up, and in the rich countries there was no change in the positioning of the rich countries. They all remained rich countries. So what was special to China and India was that they actually were poor countries, relatively poor countries in the beginning of the period, let's say 1988, 89, and by now China is like a upper middle income country. So that was this big transformation.
Mm-hmm. There are many programs against poverty worldwide, but very few focus on fighting inequality. Why?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Poverty is more easily defined. We know who is poor. Even obviously in rich countries there are people who are poor, they have social assistance and so on. And it's even easier to say at the global level because we have so-called absolute poverty. These are people who basically barely subsist on their income. But inequality is not something that is actually easily sort of fought because you don't have instruments that are actually. You have instruments that are fighting it, but these are more complex instruments. So you fight inequality by increasing the minimum wage, by making education more easily accessible, by increasing tax rates, by increasing progressivity of social transfers. But it's not as easily definable as saying we would like to reduce number of poor people by 10%.
Mm-hmm. You wrote in your book about altruism and the feeling for researchers or politicians about fighting poverty. Could you explain it a little bit?
I'm saying what exactly?
Altruism, that
yes.
People like to.
That's
poverty.
true. Yes. There I wrote about that. What I meant is that very often actually. Rich people, like to say, okay, I've been interested and I've been fighting poverty and I've donated money to fight poverty, but they don't like that their names be linked with inequality, because being sort of helping reduce poverty somehow is good. It is good, obviously, and on top of that you say, well, I'm actually a philanthropical person, so I'm helping the poor. But when we talk about inequality, you immediately somehow raise the issue of justice of that income that person had. So I think that's the problem. The rich people don't like to talk about inequality very much.
And what would you say? Who is rich?
But even if you look at these now Paradise Papers, they all were so-called fighters about poverty. Take Bono. He has traveled the world saying he's fighting against poverty. But at the same time, he has taken advantage of low taxation. He has taken advantage of fiscal havens. And he never says anything about inequality. So, poverty is in that sense, politically more sort of profitable. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, what was your question also? I'm not sure.
I asked myself, who is rich? I mean, in that point of view, it's obviously that these persons are rich. But as I found in your book, the rich countries, people in the rich countries, as well the people with lower incomes
right.
are in comparison rich.
Absolutely, because what is often not known, or because we really didn't have data about the entire world. This is something new. is when we talk about distributions in the rich countries. We are really talking about the top 25% of the world in terms of distribution. Because even the very poorest people, I'm not talking about individuals, because there are obviously some individuals in rich countries that are very, very poor, but relatively few of them. So if you take like larger groups of people, all of them are, globally speaking, in the upper part of the global income distribution. Even people who are receiving social assistance in the United States or in Germany would be somewhere around 75th or the 80th percentile in the world.
And do you think that politicians as well don't want to speak about this inequality in the world? Is that a topic as well on a level of countries?
Yes, because I think politicians, when they speak about inequality, and now they increasingly speak because it is a big issue, you know. Obama has said it was the defining issue of our time and so on. But at the global level, we don't have global government. We don't have, we have some institutions of global governance like the World Trade Organization or the IMF or the World Bank, but we don't have these institutions. So it is understandable that neither for an individual, for example in Germany or the United States or in China, global inequality is a very abstract concept. Mm-hmm. I'm actually trying in my book to show that actually there are some aspects of that concept which affect all of us, through migration, for example, through international trade. But it is still abstract. And then for politicians, it is a too abstract a topic to talk about.
Mm-hmm. The neoclassical economists predict that free market will raise income levels for all in the long run. A new middle class of some 100 million people have emerged in China and India. Are they the vanguard?
Vanguard, yeah.
Vanguard, do you think?
Yes, well, economists actually assume, or there is some evidence for that there would be ultimately convergence of incomes, which means that in that sense, maybe in, who knows, maybe 2 centuries, maybe the differences between different countries will be very small. Which, by the way, is not very different from the situation that existed, let's suppose, like 1,000 years ago. The differences between the countries were not that large because everybody was relatively poor, so the differences were small. But hopefully in 200 years we would be richer and the differences would be small.
You think so?
I think so, actually. If you look what has now happened in Asia, it's a sort of really an epochal transformation. You even 70 years ago, you had Nobel Prize winners, for example, like Jan Myrdal, who wrote the book The Asian Drama, where actually the belief was because there are so many people in Asia and they are so poor, Asia would never develop. But what we have seen is really the reverse. We have seen actually growth rates in China which have never been replicated anywhere in the world. So I'm in that sense optimistic, and I think that would also, probably in this century spread to Africa. So there will be changes. But in that sense, what is now happening in Asia, or what is happening now in Asia, is indeed the vanguard in the sense that there is a creation of something which is global middle class.
But do you think it's possible for all people to grow the boat goes up for everybody?
I cannot. Well, this is of course very speculative because we are talking about something which may happen in 100 years or 200. I don't think that this is for everybody because in any place that we look, there are some people who are better off, some in the middle, some who are poor. But what I see convergence ultimately achieving something similar to exist within the European Union. In other words, there are differences in income levels between the countries. There are differences within countries, but these are all fundamentally countries at the approximately equal level of income, worldwide speaking. Obviously, we have differences between, you have Romania and Bulgaria on the other hand, and Germany and Denmark on the other. But these gaps are relatively small compared to a gap between Mauritania and Finland, for example. Mm-hmm. So we are talking, ideally, I think we should really hope that the world would look a little bit like the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Let's come back to the Indian and Chinese people. Can we really call them middle class in comparison to United States or Europe?
No, I totally agree with you. It's a good question. It is. We call them, and I call them very loosely, and I put the quote marks because they are not, from the Western point of view, really the middle class. Which doesn't mean that there are not people there who are actually, by West European standards, middle class, but they are in countries like China and India upper class. So what is the middle actually in those countries are people who are also in the middle of the world. Actually, China now, as a whole country, is really with its mean income is about the world mean. So they are really around the global mean. But because the West is richer, so the mean of the middle class of the West is above that level. So I agree with you. We call it kind of loosely global middle class, but it's not what Western middle class is. Mm-hmm. They are poor. They're just poor. Mm.
And a lot of poor, as I understood in your book, I left the word.
The difference is
difference is growing between the middle class in Europe and United States on the one hand, and the middle class in China on the other hand.
No, I think actually, Chinese middle class, of course, is approaching the levels of because China is growing. I mean, as we speak now, for example, China's growth rate is 6% or even maybe 7%, and the Eurozone will be probably 2%. So obviously, in that sense, we do have convergence of Chinese middle class becoming more similar to the middle class of Europe. And you notice that also when you see the number of Chinese tourists in Europe and compare that with 10 years ago. There was a big difference.
Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit surprised because I found it in your book that the absolute numbers of income of the middle class in Europe and in China, it's growing.
No, what I meant also is that when I'm now talking, I'm talking about the relative numbers, it's percentage terms, that they are actually becoming more similar. But it is true that actually when you have somebody whose income is $40,000 per year and he or she grows by 5%, it is $2,000, whereas somebody whose income is $5,000, for him that represents a huge increase. So in that sense, we have at the same time less the difference in ratios or in percentages and more difference in absolute. Mm-hmm. But I tend to prefer, so to simplify matters, I prefer to use relatives, because economists generally speak in relatives, like is your income twice mine, not so much is your income like 10,000 euro bigger than mine.
Mm-hmm. There are major differences in wages in Europe, and you already mentioned it. What do you predict? Will the differences shrink, as we saw after Portugal and Spain joined the European Union? Or do you see the coming collapse of the European Union because these differences grow?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, European Union is, of course, a very interesting case because we have seen southern countries' convergence after joining the Union. Despite the fact, of course, that now with Greece that has changed, but we still have convergence with Spain and Portugal. And also we have seen convergence in Eastern Europe with Poland, with Slovakia, Czech Republic, now Romania, which is now probably the highest growing economy in Europe. So we see what we would expect is that actually a union where there is more free movement of capital, labor, and goods would tend to lead to convergence. So going back to the question that you asked me before, I mean, that kind of, if we had to have a world in 100 years which would look like the European Union today, I think would be a much better world than what we have now.
Mm-hmm. So you're optimistic?
I'm in that sense optimistic in the very long run, but it's not easy to get at that point, because I think in the same time we have a decline of the middle class in many Western countries. We have a very high competition from poorer countries, including Eastern Europe. Actually, the difficulty comes from the fact that for many of the poorer countries to grow, they're to some extent costs, let me put it like that, of the middle class in the rich countries. And we see that even in the European Union, where of course people in Germany sometimes complain that many of the jobs go to East European countries which are nearby. And so we do have a convergence, which is I think a very good development, but we also have the situation that maybe some people in rich countries lose out. So, what I think in economics is generally true. We have very few cases where everybody gains in the short run. We have the cases where everybody gains in the long run if the country becomes richer, and of course then everybody gets a little bit better off. But very often you gain a little bit and you also lose in some other respects.
The title of this Congress is The Crisis of Globalization. What is the essence of the crisis in your point of view?
The crisis of globalization is really the crisis of some features of globalization that are seen in rich countries. Because recently I was looking at the Pew Research Trust survey in the world. The question was support for globalization. And it was highest in Asia, and interestingly it's highest in Vietnam. And it's low in Europe, and the lowest country was France. So we have a situation that because of the impact on the middle class in some rich Western countries, there is a little bit of a disenchantment or dissatisfaction with globalization. And it is present here. But we should not, I think, although obviously Western countries are to a large extent determining globalization, but we should not jump immediately to the conclusion that the whole world is disenchanted with globalization because people in the West are some groups of people in the West are not happy with it.
And the crisis of globalization is not a part of ecology from your point of view.
Well, I don't address really because I don't know much about ecology and climate change and environment. I think that where it becomes a problem also is the question that we addressed before. If there is convergence and if the world becomes much richer and poor countries become richer and so on, is that world sustainable with current way of production and with current raw materials which exist and with the desire not to increase pollution and to keep the environment? So I think it's a legitimate question to ask whether really what is called the carriage capacity of the earth is sufficient for that. And I would say that actually I'm a believer that there are technological solutions to this, but I think also there is an ethical issue, because if we really say that we are against that, then we are basically saying that we are actually in favor of keeping some people poor forever so that we actually, rich people, can keep on consuming as much as we are consuming now.
Yes, we already answered this question.
Good.
What do the changes you mentioned mean for the country like Germany? And what do they mean especially for the workforce and the workers' representative?
Well, I think what the changes mean, we have seen this. Germany is, of course, considered a very big success case because obviously it has high exports and actually it is the economically most important country in Europe. On the other hand, what people, I'm sure in Germany know that, but what is less known outside of Germany is that there was a very significant period of wage stagnation, so that actually even in the household survey data that we have, you look at the lower part of the German income distribution and it has not really benefited very much over the last 20 years. So German growth in that respect, in that part of the income distribution, was not very dissimilar from American or from Japanese. So that's actually, I think, generally less well known, and I think that this is maybe to some extent reflective of these problems that the rich countries have with globalization, that one significant portion of their labor force really sees very little real gain due to globalization or in the last 20 years, and it's true in France also. And then, of course, the issue becomes whether the dissatisfaction of that group might be sufficiently important to affect political change. And obviously we have seen events like that, like with Brexit and the rise of AfD in Germany, or very strong showing of Le Pen in the elections and so on.
But from your point of view, that's a political question, not an economic.
Well, I think it's linked, because I believe that these economic problems, let's put it like that, stagnation of incomes and so on, lead to manifestation which is political. So I'm of the opinion, unlike some people, but I'm of the opinion that the ultimate reason, for example, for the success of Trump in the United States was really economic and not cultural or political, or cultural, yeah.
Mm-hmm. You have written that income depends mostly on the place where a person is born and the family he or she is born into. The efforts a person makes cannot really influence the income situation substantially. Do you see any possible way to change this?
This is what I meant actually when you look at the global income distribution. Obviously, if you sort of narrow it, let's suppose you look at the German income distribution, then your position depends quite a lot still on your parents. It may not depend that much on where you're born, because the movement of labor is free, so it might depend somewhat, and actually we have seen that with East Germany voting differently than the West Germany. But in a global context, where the differences between the countries are enormous, clearly, if you're born in Congo or Mali or Nicaragua, your life chances are very different from being born in Finland or in Japan. So that is changing to some extent because of the rise of Asia. But still, the dominant effect on your income is really the place where you were born, or more exactly, the place where you live. Because, of course, we do have migration. Now about almost 4% of the people in the world live in the countries where they were not born. So we have migration, but the number of these people, as I said, from that percentage is not very high.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still the main dominant determinant, for example, of your wages is where do you work. If you can be for equally skilled worker, or you can be a doctor, but if you work as a doctor in Africa or a bus driver in Africa, you would have much less than the bus driver in Berlin or a doctor in Berlin.
Do you think that's an ethical problem, or is it an economic problem, or?
It's an economic problem, because obviously it's not the fault of a bus driver in Berlin that he's very well paid. So it is an economic problem. But, it does have some ethical sort of aspects. And I think we have to put that problem on the table. It has ethical aspect in the following way, is that when we talk about equality of opportunity, implicitly we talk about equality of opportunity within nation state. Because we don't like the idea, for example, that you should be rich simply because your parents are rich, or maybe because you were born in a big city rather than being born in a village and so on. But we totally forget, we don't even think about the global aspect. So I think that's what my book brings up, is that actually global aspect exists. That does not mean that we have to be cosmopolitan and to actually say that some incomes are not just, but we have actually simply to accept that globally speaking, lots of your income is determined by where you're born, and that also is the force behind migration.
But do you think it's the question of justice seems to me very important in this point of view, but. It's not for you?
No, it is for me too, but I think ultimately, I would agree that ultimately, if you were really to look at the world from a point of view of somebody above the world, above the world, this would be de facto, it would be unjust. Because you can say there is an entirely identical person to you, exactly, with same effort, aptitude, intelligence, everything, and he or she is paid 10% of what you're paid. So it's clearly not just from that point of view. Now, there are different views, because you can also regard that the concept of justice changes when you move, or it's not applicable beyond the level of nation state. And the argument there is that actually within nation state, people share, obviously, ability to elect the government and to make decisions. So there is a self-determination which happens within nation state. So that was the opinion of John Rawls. So the obligations of duty of justice does not carry over across the national borders. So that's one possible view also.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, people start moving, the migrants and refugees, the numbers go up. Do you see that there's that it could be this injustice in incomes about we just have spoken? Is it possible to change it, and which institution could take a role here?
I don't think it's really a role very much of institutions. I think it's really what is necessary is what we were talking before, is the catching up or the convergence of the poor countries. In other words, China and India and Vietnam have done much more than any institution could have done. But of course, it doesn't mean that institutions for some redistribution are unimportant, and I believe in that sense, particularly because of the migration problem from Africa, which I think is going to become bigger and bigger issue for Europe. A much bigger, more important role of the European Union in helping Africa is something that should be actually really put on the table like now. Because without a significant improvement in infrastructure, in incomes in Africa, I think the pressure for migration would become unsustainable.
And who are, which is the institution or the state or?
Well, in this particular case, I think that would be the European Union, through, its own mechanisms. So in this case, I think the relationship between Europe and Africa, this would be the European Union.
And they should include the macroeconomic.
I think so. I think that there is unfortunately, there is no, I think, realization that the problem of migration for Europe is a problem that's not going to go away, and it's a problem that will become bigger and bigger because of demographic change in Africa, where 60% of the population in the next 100 years would come from. So. And the gaps of income are so large between the northern shore of the Mediterranean and the southern shore that there is no way that actually that migration will not continue and become bigger. So in that sense, I think the Europeans have to sort of think about a longer term way of addressing this problem. And helping Africa's growth rate, I think, is one of them. So I hate to use this word because everybody is using it all the time, talking about the Marshall Plan, everybody does that. But what I want to say is that a sort of a broader plan to help countries in Africa should be thought. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was my point.
But I mean, that's only can happen in the long run. No?
It's in long run, yeah. But in long run, you have to start at some point. And I think one should start now. But it's not going to give a solution in 5 years.
Mm-hmm. What does it mean for the European workforce, this problem you just mentioned?
Well, I think what I was saying for the European workforce in terms of globalization, we have seen that actually for significant parts of the European labor force, globalization was indeed a problem because simply they had to compete. In the case of, let's suppose, Germany or Austria, they had to compete with very nearby countries where the wages were 1/3 of the level here. So it is a problem, but it is something that I believe it's in the, in the nature of globalization, being such a big historical change, with many more people participating in the global labor force and actually leading to what we just talked before about convergence, you had some groups of people who lost out. And I think it's the role of nation state to actually help these people, because they cannot be helped by anybody else.
Yes, for the unions, there's a dilemma. On the one hand, they want to protect their members on the national level and see that there's a shift to the political right here in Europe, all over Europe. And on the other hand, there are the needs of the refugees and the global inequality. What do you recommend? What can they do, the unions, the European unions, and how should they respond?
Yeah, I think it's you pointed out. I think it's a big issue because there is really a trade-off there. I mean, it's clear that if the unions are essentially defending the workers and actually their members, they're also thereby. First, they cannot really have enough possibility to help refugees or economic refugees, but the economic migrants. But they also, by defending their members, they may be also taking away jobs from poor people in poor countries. So there is, I think, a trade-off there. In my opinion, we should treat the unions as having primary responsibility to their members. I don't think that the unions can really solve the problem of global poverty. I think it's actually solved at different levels, if it's solved at all. But I don't see how the unions can actually be at the same time protective of their own members, for example, in Germany, and also trying to help migrants, and also trying not to take away jobs from people in Vietnam. Because what I want to say is that there is ultimately, at some point, there is a trade-off between a job of a worker in Germany and a worker, for example, in Romania, or a worker in Vietnam. So I think that we have to sort of live in a real world and to say yes, that there may be a trade-off between the two.
You don't believe that's necessary that the unions have a more international point of view, or they work together more intensely?
I don't know much about that. Maybe they could do that, but it seems to me that, as I said, if the interests are so different, then I just don't see how, if the interest of the union in Romania is so different from the interest of the union in Germany, I just don't see how the two can actually sort of work together. Mm-hmm. I'm not against that, but I'm just saying that there is at some point where you really have a situation that if a job is lost here, then somebody else benefits from that, and if a job is protected here, that other person is losing.
So you don't have a perspective that the perspective of nation and state, as we have it now, is overcome in the future.
No, but in some, let me put it like that. It's not overcome because we still have the unions, we have to have the political system which is at nation state, we have social transfers at nation state, we have practically all taxation on nation state. As you know, the European Union, which is some kind of the most advanced supranational body, has a whole budget which is, I think, less than 1% of the GDP of all the members. So it's very small. But globalization has another sort of importance, is that it determines, regardless of nation state, it determines many of our incomes. So we have this contradiction to some, between our incomes and our jobs being determined globally, and our other payments like social transfers and so on, or our own dissatisfaction being manifested at the level of nation state. Simply, to put it very, very bluntly, you can say our jobs and incomes are determined globally, but we are as political animals within a nation state. And I think this is a kind of a contradiction that sometimes leads to problems.
Mm-hmm. And on the long run, you don't see that the nation, nation is not
disappearing.
Yes, you don't think they are.
It's difficult to say what is the long run. I would, if you look at maybe I'm not even sure how many, thousands of years we would have to look at that.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we have we have obviously moved from being, the first hunter-gatherers were small groups of people, right?
Yeah, okay.
And then we have moved to the tribal organization, and then we have moved to more sort of larger, whatever it was called, and then we came to nation state relatively recently. Actually, if you look at the European experience, even like in the Middle Ages, you had, France was a nation state, but there was no Italy, there was no Germany, they were not really, they were empires, but there was not nation state. So I think ultimately it could be, and the European Union may be a precursor of that we have larger organizations. But I think this is not something which, in my opinion, is something that we have to worry or to think much in the next century. Maybe that would be an evolution in a millennium, And there were people who actually thought that this would of course happen, and I believe that ultimately it would probably happen, but it's going to be a long time.
Not in our lifetime.
No, I don't think it will happen in our lifetime.
Okay, thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your questions. Thanks a lot. Thank you.